The alert klaxon wailed through the concrete tunnels of Sovetskaya Gavan Air Base as radar operators barked into headsets. Unidentified contact approaching from Sector 243. Altitude 27,000 feet. Possible U.S. recon aircraft. In the frigid early morning over the Sea of Japan, ground crews scrambled as two MiG-17 interceptors were readied on the tarmac. Their orders were simple: launch, intercept, and identify. But as the MiGs thundered down the runway, something odd occurred. U.S. Navy fighters were already moving to intercept them, not over open water, not mid-air, but before the Soviet jets had even left the ground. From hundreds of miles away, orbiting silently just beyond reach, a strange-looking aircraft with a massive rotating radar dish watched everything unfold. The EC-121 Warning Star, once a converted passenger liner, now a battlefield seer. Its massive surveillance radar had already mapped every MiG on the base, recorded its radar signature, tracked maintenance activity, and, most crucially, predicted exactly when those jets would launch. And this wasn't the first time. Across dozens of Pacific deployments, from Taiwan Strait standoffs to Korean airspace patrols, this ghost-like aircraft had seen Soviet fighters coming before their pilots even knew they'd been detected. It didn't jam. It didn't fire. It simply listened, watched, and whispered target coordinates into the ears of American interceptors. Soviet commanders had laughed when they first saw it. A prop-driven relic with a radar disk slapped on top. Slow, loud, obvious. But now, that aircraft was watching their every move in real time. And it wasn't alone. It was guiding fighter groups, coordinating patrols, nullifying ambushes. It had turned the air war from a contest of reflexes into a game of foreknowledge. And the worst part? The Soviets didn't even know how it was doing it. As the MiGs reached altitude, they found the skies empty. The U.S. patrol had already pulled back, mission complete, target identified, and base response clocked to the second. Back aboard the EC-121, Navy radar operators logged it all with eerie calm. This wasn't the future of warfare. It was already the present, and the Soviets had never seen it coming. In the 1,950 seconds, Soviet air doctrine was built on a single, unshakable assumption. The radar screen began on the ground. From massive phased arrays in the Far East to dense radar networks ringing Moscow, the USSR believed that its early warning system anchored in hardened bunkers and hilltop dishes was the most advanced in the world. Soviet generals had invested billions into creating overlapping coverage zones, SAM command posts, and interceptor routes. Every part of their defense posture relied on terrestrial radar assets, seeing a threat, reporting up the chain, and triggering a calculated, centralized response. To them, the idea of putting that radar on an aircraft wasn't just inefficient, it was illogical. Why put sensitive radar gear into a slow, vulnerable airplane when ground stations were safer, larger, and more powerful? Soviet analysts viewed airborne early warning concepts as a Western gimmick, an oversized experiment that could be easily shot down or jammed. In classified GRU technical briefings, the EC-121 was referred to as an American toy, suitable for reconnaissance, but not real combat. Soviet reports dismissed it as incapable of tracking fast-moving jets or low-flying intruders due to airframe instability and severe altitude limitations. After all, it was based on the Lockheed Super Constellation, a piston-engine relic from a bygone era. Worse, the Soviets assumed that if an airborne radar did detect something, it would be too slow to coordinate a response. Without instant relay to centralized command, it was useless. Doctrine dictated that only a network of fixed ground posts could manage the complexity of intercept coordination. That belief led to a dangerous blind spot. Because while Soviet generals were mocking the EC-121 for its speed, NATO was building a system that no Soviet radar could replicate, one that didn't rely on national borders, power grids, or delay-prone command trees. The warning star could move. It could loiter beyond the range of surface-to-air missiles. It could track bombers in international airspace. And most importantly, it could talk directly to fighters, guiding them like chess pieces in real time. To the Soviets, this made no sense. To the Americans, it made history. By 1962, EC-121 seconds were operating over Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, detecting MiG launches within minutes of takeoff and providing real-time radar support to Navy and Air Force pilots across the Pacific. They weren't guessing, they were watching, and the Soviets were still thinking in straight lines. In rooms filled with glowing radar scopes and maps dotted with pins, Soviet officers planned for response. But the EC-121 wasn't responding. It was already one move ahead. Soviet air doctrine in the late 1950 seconds was a reflection of two core beliefs. Control must be centralized, and speed must be overwhelming. The USSR's sprawling geography demanded tight command over its interceptor network. From Vladivostok to Murmansk, squadrons of MiG-15 seconds, -17 seconds, and later -19 seconds were positioned like guard dogs on a leash released only when a regional radar station triggered the alarm. From detection to engagement, the process was vertical. Detection went to headquarters, orders came down, and the fight began. In theory, this was order. In practice, it was inertia. When a formation of aircraft crossed into Soviet-monitored airspace, local radar might detect it. But decisions about whether it was friend or foe, whether to intercept or shadow, could take minutes. Then came the scramble orders, then launch, then climb. The system was designed to react, but only in a rigid way, and that rigidity was about to be tested. Because the EC-121 didn't operate within that hierarchy. It didn't wait for permission to detect, classify, or report. It was already airborne, orbiting over the ocean with a real-time view of both Soviet and NATO flight patterns. More than just eyes, it was a brain in the sky, a command node that didn't need Moscow's approval to act. Its radar operators could spot MiGs the moment their engines lit up on the tarmac. Its communications systems could link directly to nearby F-4 Phantoms or F-8 Crusaders. While Soviet jets were still climbing to altitude, American pilots were already maneuvering into advantage. The implications were devastating. Soviet doctrine had no answer for a flying GCI, ground control intercept platform. They had never imagined that an airborne radar could process and act on information faster than a command bunker. Their model assumed that information needed relays, layers, and orders, but EC-121 seconds cut out the middleman. This wasn't just a new aircraft. It was a doctrinal earthquake, and every time a Soviet fighter found itself flanked or intercepted in what should have been neutral airspace, the fault lines widened. The EC-121 wasn't invading territory. It was invading reaction time. And that broke more than radar, it broke trust in Soviet assumptions. It happened on a cold morning in early 1964, somewhere east of Okinawa. An EC-121 warning star had been orbiting its standard patrol track for over 6 hours. Its massive AN/APS-95 radar scanned the region in wide arcs, tracing dozens of commercial aircraft routes, weather formations, and faint emissions from distant land-based radars. Nothing unusual, until it wasn't. A sudden burst of radar noise, brief, narrow, and telling, registered on the console of Petty Officer First Class Richard Hall, the senior radar tech on board. It was the unmistakable spike of a fighter warming its radar on the ground. Within moments, 2 more spikes flared in sequence. Operators logged the base location, emission signature, and bearing. The EC-121 had just detected Soviet MiGs powering up, their radars flickering to life on a base still cloaked in coastal fog before they ever took off. Within 3 minutes, Hall's team had analyzed the emissions and locked in the type MiG-17 Frescos. The heading of the radars and the intermittent signal chatter suggested an intercept mission. Soviet fighters were preparing to engage something coming in from the Philippine Sea. But the something was already aware. U.S. Navy pilots flying F-4 Phantoms off the USS Ticonderoga had been monitoring the EC-121's updates via encrypted radio. They adjusted course slightly, just enough to spoil the Soviet intercept vector. Then they split formation, allowing one Phantom to descend out of radar view while the other two climbed to bait the MiGs. The Soviet jets took off precisely 12 minutes later, but the trap had already failed. By the time the MiGs reached altitude, the U.S. aircraft had disappeared. One had looped south toward Taiwan, another had circled back east, and one remained silently tracking the MiGs from below, radar cold, guided only by positional data from the EC-121 far over the horizon. The MiGs turned north, confused, then west, then back. Eventually they returned to base, their mission unfulfilled, their fuel half spent. The entire battle, if it could be called that, had unfolded with no missiles fired, no dogfight, and no radar lock. It had ended before it began, and it had been decided not by pilots or generals but by the quiet, buzzing consoles on a propeller-driven aircraft 200 miles offshore. The EC-121 had done something previously thought impossible. It defeated a Soviet intercept before the intercept even launched. When the after-action report reached the Pacific Command, it was marked extraordinary effectiveness. Within weeks, the EC-121 was granted expanded patrol authority. No longer just a radar platform, it was now an active component of intercept planning, and in Soviet war rooms, where MiG crews were grilled on failed intercepts, one terrifying realization began to spread. The Americans didn't just see them coming, they saw them before they moved. When reports first filtered back to Soviet high command about failed intercepts in the Pacific missions that never made contact, engagements where NATO aircraft seemed to vanish or evade before even being detected, the initial reaction was cold dismissal. Soviet generals, especially those steeped in air defense command, refused to believe that an American radar plane could track their jets before takeoff. The narrative from field commanders was labeled operator error, faulty MiG avionics, misread radar displays, perhaps even equipment sabotage by undisciplined crews. Internal investigations focused on the reliability of the MiG-17's ground control links, the calibration of airport radars, or fuel allocation mismanagement, not on the possibility that American aircraft had anticipated their every move. The idea that a propeller-driven aircraft, the EC-121, could predict flight paths, detect radar pings from the ground, and direct fighters hundreds of miles away? Impossible. In Moscow, this bordered on heresy. To Soviet analysts, airborne radar platforms were tools of limited scope. They could detect, perhaps surveil, but the concept of real-time tactical direction from such a platform didn't align with Marxist-Leninist military hierarchy. Command came from the ground, always. The Americans, they reasoned, were playing theater games. There had to be a hidden base relay or some form of satellite intelligence at work. The EC-121 couldn't operate independently. It was too slow, too primitive. Its capabilities were exaggerated by U.S. pilots seeking glory in debriefs. Yet, as more intercept missions failed, and as MiG squadrons returned confused, having been flanked, lured, or simply unable to locate their targets, the illusion began to fracture. In one classified GRU internal memo from late 1965, an anonymous intelligence officer noted, "Either American aircraft are operating under total foresight, or we are blind in the places we thought we saw best." Still, no structural changes came. No new doctrine, no new investment in airborne radar programs. Moscow's institutional pride was too rigid. It was easier to blame malfunction, human error, or enemy deception than to admit that a new kind of warfare fought not with missiles but with minutes had already begun. And that refusal to believe cost them every time a MiG scrambled and found nothing. Because while they questioned what the Americans were seeing, they never asked how they were seeing it. Faced with mounting anomalies, failed interceptions, enemy aircraft evading detection, and U.S. fighters appearing where they shouldn't. The Soviet High Command began looking inward, but instead of questioning their assumptions about airborne radar, they crafted a theory that seemed logical and disastrously wrong. They concluded that NATO had likely developed a new class of passive electronic intelligence platforms. In their view, the Americans weren't using radar to track Soviet jets, they were intercepting internal signals, picking up command transmissions between Soviet airfields and MiG squadrons. If the enemy could listen in on control frequencies, then they could anticipate takeoffs, flight plans, and maneuver vectors without ever needing radar contact. To the Soviet mindset, this explained everything. The EC-121 was simply a giant listening post, not a detection system. The U.S. wasn't seeing MiGs, they were reading them. This theory had one benefit. It allowed Soviet planners to preserve their faith in ground-based radar supremacy. If the Americans weren't seeing anything, just eavesdropping, then the answer was simple: encrypt the signals, switch channels, shorten command phrases, reinforce ComSec. So they did. A massive overhaul of communication protocols across the Pacific Fleet and forward air bases began in 1966. Encryption standards were changed. Voice traffic was reduced. Dummy transmissions were introduced to mislead enemy listeners. And then, they waited. The next EC-121 patrol was met with a carefully timed ambush. MiG-19 seconds launched under strict radio silence, taking off from an alternate runway and flying a zigzag ascent to avoid radar acquisition. They approached the area where U.S. aircraft had previously operated and found it empty. Again, not only had the Americans avoided the intercept, they had already rerouted their patrols to new sectors. Based on movement patterns the Soviets had no idea were visible. Because the EC-121 wasn't reading transmissions, it was reading reflections. The warning star's radar, powerful and tuned for long-range scan, was bouncing signals off the Soviet coastline, detecting airframe contours, runway taxi patterns, and even hangar emissions. It wasn't passive, it was active, and it was drawing a moving map of Soviet aerial posture from 300 miles away. But the Soviet theory refused to die. Even after dozens of failed attempts to spoof the EC-121, Moscow's radar command remained convinced the threat was informational, not observational, and so they fortified the wrong systems, encrypted the wrong frequencies, trusted the wrong assumptions, all while a slow, aging aircraft flying high above the Pacific continued to see every move they made before it even left the ground. After their electronic countermeasures failed to disrupt the EC-121's effectiveness, Soviet analysts scrambled for a new explanation, one that could preserve their doctrine without conceding that they were being outplayed by an aging, prop-driven aircraft. The second theory they landed on was subtler, and even further from the truth. They theorized that ground-based radar leakage was the culprit. Soviet radar stations, spread across the Far East and coastal regions, were powerful and often left operating at full strength around the clock. These stations swept wide arcs of airspace to detect intrusions from U.S. spy planes, bombers, or reconnaissance aircraft. But in doing so, they emitted powerful, predictable signatures that could, in theory, reveal Soviet air operations unintentionally. According to this logic, American aircraft like the EC-121 weren't actively scanning Soviet bases, they were passively detecting reflected radar energy or tracking secondary emissions bouncing off Soviet terrain and aircraft. The Americans weren't watching aircraft taxi or warm up, they were simply reading the background noise and drawing conclusions. To Soviet planners, this made sense. It was a technical loophole, not a doctrinal failure. If the Americans were exploiting radar leakage, the solution was to reduce emissions or shield their stations. So Soviet engineers got to work. Over the next 2 years, a wave of expensive modifications rolled out across Pacific radar sites. Emission angles were narrowed. Side lobes were minimized. Radomes were restructured to reduce spill. In some locations, Radars were even turned off during sensitive operations. And yet, nothing changed. EC-121 seconds continued to detect launches. U.S. fighters still arrived ahead of MiG patrols. Interceptions still failed. In one chilling incident, Soviet jets flew under radio silence, launched from a radar-blackened zone, and climbed through a no-emissions corridor, only to be flanked by American fighters mid-climb. Again, the EC-121 had seen them without intercepting signals or reading radar spills. It was using its own active sweep, bouncing radar waves over the curvature of the Earth, analyzing return data from low angles and terrain shadows. The Soviets had built a wall of silence, but they had forgotten one thing. The warning star could see without listening. And worse, it could share that vision instantly with pilots hundreds of miles away. In desperation, Soviet generals began to suspect satellite reconnaissance, secret submarines, even weather balloon networks. Anything but the truth that the old, slow American aircraft orbiting at 25,000 feet was watching everything in real time. It wasn't leaks. It wasn't espionage. It was a revolution in mobile radar power. And the Soviets were chasing shadows while it flew circles around them. By the late 1,960 seconds, it was no longer a mystery. The Americans weren't guessing. They weren't intercepting Soviet orders or triangulating radar spills. They were watching, tracking, and directing with precision in real time. And yet, Soviet intelligence failed to fully grasp the scale of the EC-121's capabilities until it was too late. Part of this failure lay in a fundamental misreading of how the Americans were evolving. The Soviets viewed airborne radar platforms as passive collectors, useful for surveillance, but not direct participants in command. In contrast, U.S. doctrine was shifting fast. The EC-121 was no longer just gathering data, it was coordinating offensive strategy. This evolution went completely unnoticed by Soviet analysts for years. During operations off Vietnam, EC-121 seconds flew round-the-clock patrols over the Gulf of Tonkin. Their mission? Detect MiG launches from the north, vector Navy fighters onto them, and coordinate entire air patrols in real time. These missions, under the Big I and College I call signs, were among the first demonstrations of integrated air combat control from an airborne platform. The results were devastating. MiG pilots would launch, expecting surprise, and instead find U.S. fighters already positioned to intercept. On one occasion in 1967, a MiG-21, attempting to shadow an American strike group, was intercepted and driven off before it ever got visual contact, thanks to real-time tracking from an EC-121 orbiting hundreds of miles offshore. Soviet observers embedded with North Vietnamese forces struggled to explain it. Their mistake? They believed that coordination still depended on centralized command. They assumed U.S. fighters were waiting for instructions from naval command ships or bases in Thailand. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. The EC-121 was the command. Its rotating radar dome, capable of detecting targets at 250-300 miles, wasn't just watching the sky. It was managing it. Operators aboard the warning star could relay intercept vectors, altitude bands, and threat warnings instantly to multiple aircraft simultaneously, long before Soviet counterparts could react. And still, Soviet intelligence reports clung to outdated models. Even as multiple failed MiG intercepts were logged, even as Soviet-aligned nations suffered crushing air losses in engagements coordinated by AWACS-style support, Moscow never updated its doctrine to match. They refused to believe command could be airborne, flexible, and distributed. This was the fatal gap. While the EC-121 was training generations of U.S. radar operators in networked air control, the Soviet Union continued to build hardened radar bunkers for a kind of war that no longer existed. The Americans had unlocked the next era of air warfare, the era of the flying brain. and Soviet intelligence, despite all its reach, had no idea how far behind they truly were. What made the EC-121 warning star such a game-changer wasn't just its radar. It was the way it reshaped command itself. The aircraft, a heavily modified Lockheed Super Constellation, looked outdated even in its prime. With 4 piston engines and a lumbering frame, it couldn't outrun anything and couldn't hide from anyone. But what it lacked in speed, it made up for in one unparalleled advantage: vision. At the heart of the EC-121 was the APS-95 radar system, mounted inside the distinctive ventral and dorsal radomes. This radar could detect airborne targets at over 250 miles, track low-flying aircraft skimming over the sea, and most critically maintain continuous surveillance of both enemy airspace and friendly patrol zones. But this wasn't just about detection. It was about coordination. For the first time in U.S. military history, radar operators were airborne, not hundreds of miles away in a command bunker, but above the battlefield, seeing the fight unfold in real time, guiding fighters like chess pieces with unmatched precision. When a MiG launched from a North Korean or Soviet-aligned airfield, the EC-121 would pick up its radar signal within seconds. Operators would compare it to an electronic library of known threat signatures, estimate its trajectory, and relay that data directly to American fighters on patrol long before the enemy pilot even cleared the clouds. In many cases, the EC-121 would assign intercept vectors directly telling an F-4 or F-8 crew not just where the enemy was, but where they would be in 90 seconds. This was predictive air combat, fueled not by guesswork, but by data. And it wasn't limited to fighters. During long-range bombing raids, the EC-121 coordinated electronic countermeasures, monitored for enemy radar lock-ons, and alerted strike aircraft to changing threats in real time. It became a nerve center in the sky, the command post that followed the fleet wherever it went. By the Vietnam War, EC-121 seconds were flying daily missions under codenames like Big Eye, College Eye, and Disco. Crews would spend up to 12 hours on station, scanning for MiG launches and SAM activity, controlling fighter patrols, and feeding constant situational updates to U.S. Pacific Command. This airborne control system gave American pilots something their Soviet counterparts never had: situational dominance. They weren't reacting to threats, they were anticipating them. Meanwhile, Soviet pilots relying on ground control and delayed communications were constantly behind, flying blind into skies where the enemy already knew where they'd be. The true American system wasn't just the EC-121's radar dome, it was the network it created, a system where fighters, bombers, and surveillance platforms all moved in harmony, guided by a platform that saw what others couldn't. And that system didn't just win dogfights, it rewrote air combat itself. It was supposed to be a routine show of strength. In the summer of 1968, Soviet naval aviation staged a coordinated exercise in the Sea of Okhotsk, just off the eastern coast of the USSR. A dozen aircraft, including 2 95 Bears and a flight of MiG-17 seconds, were tasked with testing U.S. response time. The mission: probe the outer air defense zones near Japan, simulate a multi-vector approach, and identify weaknesses in U.S. Pacific Fleet patrols. What Soviet planners didn't know was that a single EC-121 warning star had already been patrolling the region for hours. Flying a lazy racetrack orbit just south of Hokkaido, the aircraft had quietly logged every transmission, radar spike, and formation takeoff from Soviet bases on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Its operators had watched the 2 95 seconds power up, logged the direction of the MiG squadrons, timed the moment they left the runway, and fed all of it in real time to a nearby carrier group and its combat air patrols. As the 2 95 bombers cruised toward international airspace, 2 U.S. Navy F-4 Phantoms climbed to intercept. Guided not by guesswork, but by precise bearing and altitude data from the EC-121. They made visual contact at a distance of 90 miles, far outside the Soviet detection envelope, and mirrored the bomber formation from just beyond range. Then came the MiGs. Soviet interceptors scrambled from a forward base near Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, flying a staggered vector designed to confuse U.S. radar systems. But they never had a chance. The EC-121 tracked them from the moment they lifted off. It relayed their heading, climb rate, and estimated intercept window to another pair of American fighters, flying high cover. By the time the MiGs reached cruising altitude, the U.S. fighters had already repositioned, splitting into mirrored flanks and pinning the Soviet aircraft in a predictable arc. The Soviets, suddenly realizing they were being shadowed before contact had even been made, aborted the intercept. They turned back. On paper, no missiles were fired, no radar locks, no direct engagement, but the humiliation was total. U.S. pilots had seen them before they were seen, had positioned before the Soviets were airborne, had executed a perfect, invisible checkmate without breaking international airspace. Back in Moscow, the after-action analysis was terse. American patrol aircraft demonstrated unacceptable tactical prescience. Air response protocols failed to gain initiative. It was the moment Soviet Air Command could no longer deny the truth. The EC-121 was more than a surveillance tool. It was a tactical orchestrator, capable of coordinating multi-layered intercepts and rendering Soviet ambush tactics useless. The MiGs never got a second chance. The EC-121 stayed on station for another 8 hours, watching, logging, and reminding every Soviet radar operator across the Pacific, "You're not the hunter anymore." The EC-121 warning star had done more than outmaneuver Soviet fighters, it had collapsed a doctrine. For decades, Soviet strategy relied on the concept of layered defense. Centralized radar, massed formations, and airbases fortified with heavy anti-aircraft systems were the foundation of how the USSR envisioned controlling the sky. Air war, to them, was a vertical chain of command: radar detected, command assessed, and fighters engaged. But the EC-121 made that chain irrelevant. With every mission, it exposed how slow, brittle, and outdated Soviet command truly was. While Moscow still clung to fixed ground posts, the United States had created mobile command brains, airborne systems that could not only see but think and act in real time. The implications weren't just tactical, they were ideological. The USSR's military-industrial complex had poured billions into building static networks of surface-to-air missiles, radar domes, and hardened bunkers. But the EC-121 showed that the future of warfare was dynamic, networked, and decentralized. By 1970, American fighters in the Pacific didn't rely on AWACS for support, they expected it. It became the norm for pilots to launch, knowing they had a full picture of the airspace long before they were threatened. In contrast, Soviet pilots continued operating under the assumption that their first visual contact might be their only one, and it was usually too late. This asymmetry caused panic within Soviet defense circles, yet the USSR was too invested in its outdated command structures to change quickly. It wouldn't be until the late 1982, 2 decades too late, that the Soviet Union would begin serious development of their own airborne early warning aircraft, like the Beriev A-50. Even then, they were still playing catch-up, because what the EC-121 revealed wasn't just tactical superiority, it showed that information dominance was now the deciding factor in air combat. Radar wasn't about finding planes, it was about controlling space, reshaping the battlefield with data, and rewriting the timeline of conflict. The Soviets had invested in steel, speed, and shock. The Americans had invested in sight, and in doing so, they built a system that rendered Soviet superiority obsolete before the first missile was ever fired. The collapse wasn't loud, it was quiet, invisible, orchestrated from 25,000 feet above. by a propeller-driven plane no one believed would matter. The EC-121 warning star never fired a shot. It didn't carry missiles. It didn't drop bombs. But its radar dish may have been the most dangerous weapon of the Cold War. Long after its retirement in the early 1982s, the legacy of the EC-121 echoed in every combat air patrol, every stealth sortie, every satellite-guided strike that followed. It was the proof of concept that gave birth to the E-3 Sentry AWACS, to the doctrine of real-time joint command, and to the modern air war as we know it. Its operators were never seen, its victories rarely publicized. But in room after room, during hundreds of intercepts and dozens of conflicts, it dictated the tempo of battle from just over the horizon. For the Soviet Union, it was a phantom never directly engaged, never caught, but always there. It reshaped how the U.S. Navy and Air Force thought about presence. With the warning star overhead, every carrier group moved with confidence. Every fighter pilot launched knowing someone was watching. Every battle became a data-driven dance choreographed by quiet voices hundreds of miles away. And even now, decades later, the principles it proved are the bedrock of modern warfare. Today's fifth-generation fighters, global strike assets, and unmanned systems still rely on the invisible thread first spun by the EC-121, the power to see, to know, to decide, before the enemy can react. It didn't just give America the edge, it gave America the timeline, and that, more than stealth or firepower, was the true weapon the Soviets never understood, because they were still preparing to fight the last war, while the EC-121 was already watching the next one begin.